Yeah. So glad that was caught on camera. Hello everyone! Welcome to the Fairy Tale Corner. This is where we discuss books and the truths revealed to us by God, passed down through the generations in the forms of fairy tales. My name's Rebecca. I'm so excited to be here with you today. Over a year ago, I decided that I had to do something about my reading. At the time, I wasn't really reading anything. Our family has a very extensive library, especially when it comes to the classics, but that can make it hard to decide what to read because there are so many options, so I decided to try something new. I decided that I just wanted to read all of the classics that we owned. We have a lot of classics, so I knew I needed a plan. So I decided that probably the thing that made most sense to do was to read them in order. So, got out my iPad, went over to the bookshelf, started pulling off books that looked old, and looking up dates and seeing when they were written, and organizing, and preparing the first section of my new reading plan, which I call Reading Through History. But I thought that now that I've read these books, and I want to talk about them, I thought it might be a good idea to make a video reviewing all the books in the plan that I've read thus far. So I'm just going to give my thoughts on the book, and then I'll rate it on a scale of 0 to 10. So excited that you're here with me. Let's get into it. The Epic of Gilgamesh. This was written in ancient Mesopotamia. I'm not sure of the date. It's the oldest known literary work that we have. It was found written on clay tablets. A lot of sections were missing. Some of them have since been filled in, but reading it, there's still a lot missing. So my thoughts on this one was that it was easier to read than I expected. Even with the parts missing, I expected the language to be really difficult to get through, and it was at first. But once I got into it, I could understand mostly what was going on. There were a lot of cultural references I didn't get at all because their culture was very different from ours. Speaking of which, one thing I did not like about this was in how the men treated women. They were not respectful of women at all. It was entertaining at parts. It was very interesting. I mean, you're reading a work that's thousands of years old, and that's just mind-blowing to know that we can still read the stories that our ancestors told to each other. And so for that, I'm really glad that I read it. It's not that great. That being said, it's a literary work from a pagan culture, so it doesn't have a lot of truth in it. It has some truth in it, right, but there's not a lot. I'm probably not going to read it again, just because I've read it now and I'm good now, but it wasn't horrible. I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. Hesiod's Theogony. This is a recount of the ancient Greeks' creation myth and the relationships between all the gods. For that, it was very helpful to read. I never understood what all the relationships were between the different gods in the Greek pantheon, and with this, I finally did understand it, and I was grateful for that, but also, ew. It was very interesting also to read another culture's creation myth and compare it to the story in Genesis. Now, obviously, as far as that goes, it's completely false. They believe that there were other races of man before us, a golden race, then a bronze race, then a clay race, and then we came along, a flesh race, which is false. We are made in the image and likeness of God. We are not an inferior race to the races that came before us. You might also be familiar with the story of Pandora, which is recounted in this book. Pandora, according to the Greeks, was the first woman to be created, and actually Zeus created her as a punishment for something that man did. And when you look at it that way, suddenly the Greeks' disrespect of women really becomes clear. If they believed that women were a punishment rather than a gift, because God said that it's not good for man to be alone, and so he gave Adam, Eve, flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, and women are now necessary for mankind to be complete. In fact, we're necessary for it to even continue. We have an inherent dignity that is uncomprehendable, and especially now with Mary, she is the most blessed of all women, so women are definitely not a punishment for man. I don't want to be too negative. I enjoyed reading this. It's not very true, and it is important to furnish our mind with true things. I would recommend that if someone wanted to read this, go ahead and read it. It's very short, very interesting read. I enjoyed it. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. And contained in the same book, we have Hesiod's Works and Days. This is a recount of what Hesiod and supposedly the people of his time believed was necessary to be a good person. Now with that, it was really enjoyable because you get to see what another culture thinks that goodness is. There were some pretty really funny parts of it because our culture's not that way. Like Hesiod at one point, he goes on to talk about how it's better to farm naked because the agricultural goddess Demeter, she was pleased by that. She was aroused by it, and so she would give you a better harvest. So there are some funny parts like that. There was some truth contained in here. Like, obviously, their culture was very wrong about a lot of things, but there were some true things about how a person should behave. At least as far as I remember it. It was a while ago that I read it, but I enjoyed reading it. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. The Iliad of Homer. Right, so this is one that probably more people have read. I really liked the beginning and the end, except the end was very sad. Agamemnon dies. Oh, I said the wrong thing. Not Agamemnon, Achilles dies. Spoilers, sorry, this was written, thousands of years ago. But Patroclus dies, and then Hector dies, and then Achilles dies, and it's just like all this death of the best characters. I don't remember if Menelaus dies. He was another good character. But then Agamemnon lives, and Agamemnon drove me crazy while I was reading this book. I hated Agamemnon, and Paris too. Although Paris does die, but I don't even remember that part. I had to look up whether he died in it. Like I said, I liked the beginning and the end, because that was all the personal stuff. In between, it's just a ton of gore. Lots of gory battles. Most interesting part, though, was with Odysseus. He snuck into the Trojans' camp as a spy. That was a really good part. It took me forever to get through this book. It was very long, too long for my taste. Obviously, I'm not going to say anything more negative about this book because it's the Iliad. And it is famous for very good reason. The poetic structure is incredible. I can just open it at random and read a section, and it's beautiful. And meanwhile, the Argives and Trojans fought on in massed battle. Nor was the Danaans' ditch going to hold them back, nor the wide wall above it they had built for the sake of their ships, and driven a deep ditch about it, and had not given to the gods grand sacrifices, so that it might guard their running ships and their masses of spoil within it. The poetic structure is beautiful. The Homeric similes, they're brilliant, and it really enriched my mind reading this. Not the content so much, but the quality of the writing. It's a great work of literature. I think it is good that so many classically educated students have read it. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. I know that's a low score, but an objective literary score, I'd probably give it a 7, but I'm including my own personal enjoyment of these books in it, so I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. The Odyssey of Homer. I enjoyed this one much more than the Iliad because it had character and humor, and I really like Odysseus as a character. You can root for him getting home to his wife until he's unfaithful to her with Calypso in the middle of it. And then you wonder why you like this character so much. And that's the problem with a lot, or indeed all, of these ancient Greek stories, because you can't really root for the characters as much as you want to. I'm not saying that pagans can't have good works, because obviously they do. But the characters they write about, their mythical heroes, aren't really heroes. They're not the princes in fairy tales who are good and faithful, and obviously all human beings are flawed. But if a prince in a fairy tale had been unfaithful to his wife the way Odysseus is in this, he would have been duly punished. Instead, Odysseus gets to go home to his wife. Everything turns out good for him in the end. Maybe not great, he has a lot of problems, but he's never directly punished for that infidelity. That's a problem with a lot of these works, is the truth is clouded because they don't have the right moral compass. Anyway, my opinion, this is a better work of literature than the Iliad because of its focus on character and not on the overall war, though that could just be a personal preference because I'm not as much of a fan of war stories. I am a woman, right? I prefer a character. It was still too long for my taste, but I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. The Orestia by Aeschylus. Aeschylus? I'm not sure. We have the Orestia. This one is a set of 3 plays: Agamemnon, the Libation Bearers, and the Eumenides. I hope I'm saying those right, I was very excited to get into shorter stories after the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this one was shorter, and the quality of the writing is exceptional. Aeschylus was clearly a very good technical writer. His style is unobjectionable. That sounded negative, but I mean, like, I can't object to it. It's really good. The content, however, I did not enjoy. Highly disturbing because it's about Agamemnon comes home from the Trojan War and he killed his daughter. He sacrificed her to the gods so that they could cross the ocean to get to the war in the first place. And his wife is not happy about that. So when Agamemnon gets home, his wife kills him. And then in the next two plays, the libation bearers and the Eumenides, it's years later when their son has grown up and their other daughter, and the son and the daughter conspire together to kill their mother. So the son is Orestes, that's why it's called the Orestia. Orestes does kill his mother, but right before she dies, she curses him. And so for the rest of his life, he's running from these curses who are trying to, tear into him, and he's pursued and plagued and in torment for the rest of his life because his mother cursed him, because he killed her, because she killed his father, because his father killed his sister. So the story was very disturbing. I didn't enjoy it at all. The only thing that got me through it was I'd focus on the technical aspects of the writing, which were very good. So for that reason, I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. Kind of the same reason I rated the Iliad that amount, is high points for the quality of the writing, but low points for the quality of the content. The 3 Theban plays by Sophocles, these were very good. They're still tragedies, because that's pretty much what the Greeks wrote, except there were a few comedies. We'll get to those later. But I didn't feel miserable reading it. It wasn't like a super disturbing story like the last one was. Mostly because the characters in it weren't that culpable. This is the story about Oedipus. When he was born, a seer foretold that he would kill his father and marry his mother. In fear of that coming true, his father tried to kill his own son. He gave Oedipus to someone to kill, but the man didn't end up killing Oedipus. He just raised him as his own. When Oedipus grew up, I'm pretty sure he didn't know about his fate. He at least didn't know he was adopted. When Oedipus came back, he ended up killing his father without knowing that it was his real father, and then marrying his mother without knowing it was his real mother. The point of the plays is that fate is inescapable. Now that isn't actually true, because while the gods of Greece may doom a man to sin in spite of his actions, God does not. God takes into account what men do, and he rewards them as they deserve. He doesn't just decide that this person is going to kill his father and sleep with his mother. If the man decides to kill his father and sleep with his mother, God will punish that, but God will not fate that to happen. And if someone foresees that that's going to happen, the man will still have the opportunity to change his fate. We always have a choice, and the Greeks didn't understand that, but we do now as Christians. We understand that we have a choice in what we do. This was very enjoyable to read. It was a great relief after reading the Orestia that this one was better. In my opinion, it's the best of the Greek plays that I read. In fact, it's probably the best Greek story that I've read. I really recommend this one. Sophocles may not have been as good a technical writer as Aeschylus was, but he's still very, very good, and the content is great, and the emotion in a scene just pours off of the page. I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. Basically anything above an 8, I might end up reading again. Several plays by Euripides the Fifth. Now, I'd completely forgotten that I even read this, and that's a bad sign. I block out stuff that I really don't like. I mean, unless it haunts me and I can literally never forget it. The only thing I remember from these is in, oh wait, hold on. Okay, never mind. As I was talking about it, some of it was coming back to me, and I still don't like it. So the thing I remember from the Bacchae is when this woman is under a spell and she cuts off the head of her son. She thinks her son is a lion, so she cuts off his head. She's burying it in triumph through the city, and it's horribly disturbing. And now I've cursed you with this knowledge, so you're welcome. And then we have Iphigenia in Aulis. You remember I told you how Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter to the gods? Well, this is the story of that. Very very cheerful. I knew it was going to happen the whole time, and so I was just miserable reading it because this poor girl thinks that it's good for her to be sacrificed. Like, during the first part, she's afraid and upset and trying to escape her fate, and then like later they convince her that it's good and noble for her to sacrifice herself, and so she goes willingly to her death. And this is very sad. We can laugh about how sexist the Greeks were or whatever, but it's very sad and tragic how they really had no regard for women and thought that it was a noble thing for her to allow herself to be sacrificed. You don't hear stories where they're gonna sacrifice their sons and their sons act like this. And everyone's admiring her for her courage, and they're all crying towards the end, and I really could not feel sorry for a single one of them, because, you know, Achilles is in it, Menelaus is in it. Menelaus, who I previously really liked from the Iliad, he's a horrible person in this play because he's the main person trying to get Iphigenia to be sacrificed. Achilles and Menelaus and Odysseus, they're all like so sad because her courage brings tears to their eyes, and they're mourning that such a wonderful girl has to die when she doesn't have to die. This play made me very angry. Then you have the play about the Cyclops, and that's the story of, you know, Odysseus and the Cyclops, which I don't remember. Sure, I think it was okay. I don't really remember. Ressus, as far as I remember, is the story of like an ally coming to Troy to aid them, and then I think Odysseus sneaks in and kills him. So I actually do remember these plays, unfortunately, because the one about the Cyclops was fine, the one about Ressus, whatever. I didn't really care. That's the problem. I didn't care. I was just exhausted by the Greeks by this point. I was like, seriously, I'm so done with you because I just want you to tell a story about a good person. Going back to Iphigenia, it makes me think of the story of Abraham and Isaac, because you can see some similarities. God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and Abraham was going to do it. In a similar way, the gods of Greece told Agamemnon that if he wanted to cross the sea, he needed to sacrifice his daughter. There are very important things to consider. God is an all-loving God, and he told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac for a reason, and his reason is love. We may not understand exactly why, but we know that his reason is love. And he stopped Abraham before Abraham did it. Isaac did not die. Whereas the gods of Greece, they're telling Agamemnon to sacrifice his daughter because they're mad at him, and the only way that they can be satisfied is by the blood of his daughter. And she dies in the end. They want her blood because they're demons. They may be fictional characters, but there are demons tied to those fictional characters, and they took on the character of the Greek gods. And I don't know if the story of Iphigenia is true. I hope it's not, but it might be. And the thing is, so many pagan cultures practiced human sacrifice because they're worshiping demons. When you think about that, actually demonstrates Abraham's incredible faith to know that all these pagan cultures around him are practicing human sacrifice, and God tells him to sacrifice his son. And Abraham, knowing that God is all loving, does it. I mean, he gets stopped in the end, but he's willing to do it. Even though he knows how evil it is, he knows God's voice well enough to know that it is God speaking to him and not a demon trying to trick him. That does demonstrate great faith. Makes you very grateful for our Christian stories that we tell. Because if we didn't have Christ, if we didn't have an all-loving God, there couldn't be stories with happy endings. And Aristotle talks about that in a book that I'll get to in a minute, about how in Greek comedies, there's stories about bad people who have a happy ending. And in Greek tragedies, there's stories about good people who have a bad ending. And that's the way it worked for the Greeks. You couldn't have a story about a good person who has a good ending. But with Christianity, with the resurrection, we have stories about good people. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. I'm going to give this a 4 out of 10. I lost more from reading it than I benefited from reading it. And the only benefit I really got from it was seeing a lie so that I could recognize the truth. So I'm going to give Euripides V's plays 4 out of 10. The Histories by Herodotus. Okay, so I was very grateful to have a break from stories at this point. I was getting very cynical about stories in general after reading all of those tragedies. So this was a nice break. It was a very long break though. And I don't want to say that length in general is bad. It's more of a personal thing for me. If I love a book, I never want it to end. And I've been known known to cry when a book that I loved is over, because it's over and I can't read it anymore. But if I don't absolutely love a story, I don't want it to go on for so long. It's just too long for me. I did enjoy reading this. Once I gave myself more permission to skim it. I would just focus when it was interesting, definitely not for a younger teenager to read. I know, like, in the Colby Academy course, this is given to freshmen to read, as in 14-year-olds, and I think my mom had the right idea when she blocked out certain passages because of that. I don't know if Colby recommended doing that or if it was my mom's idea, but there are some pretty deplorable people in those times, and so they did pretty horrible things. While it may be interesting to read about, it's not good. It's definitely bad, and it may even be bad to read about them. I don't know. It was very helpful in understanding more of what went on in those times and more of what cultures were like, and for that I enjoyed it, and getting a sense of the Persian Wars towards the end, I enjoyed that too. It's very long, and I'm not likely to read it again, so I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. Aristophanes' Birds. I don't know exactly what to say. This is supposed to be a Greek comedy. There were no funny parts. I didn't get any of the jokes. Even the jokes I did get, they were raunchy jokes. And they used the F word and, just whatever. I did not enjoy this play. I'm gonna give it a 2 out of 10. Now, it's not a 0 because it has structure to it and the writing, fine, whatever. It's not Shakespeare. Literally, it's not as good as Shakespeare's plays. It's not as good as some of the other plays. But you can recognize that it's a play that has decent structure. But the only thing that's keeping it from being a 1 is that it's not as bad as it could be. I suffered through it hoping that the next one would be better. I was naive. Also contained in this book, Lysistrata. That play was disgusting. The Greeks don't understand women at all. And I know men don't understand women. Like, even psychologists, Jordan Peterson always talks about how no man can understand women. But the Greeks didn't even know what women acted like. It's about these women and how they want this war to be over. And they feel like they have no real power because the men decide, when to go off to war. But Lysistrata has an idea. She says, you know what, guys? We do have power. Until our husbands stop this war, we're not going to sleep with them. That would be an uncomfortable enough theme already. But what makes it worse is that these women are all miserable because they can't sleep with their husbands. Women don't do that. These women all act like men, and it's just disturbing, and I don't like it, and I wish I never read it. I did not finish it. I was not going to suffer through, so I don't know how the play ends. But in my opinion, the fact that we have Aristophanes' play today is proof of the fact that it's not always the best works that survive the test of time. Or if these are the best Greek comedies, then I'm so glad that we don't have other Greek comedies surviving today. So this is a 1 out of 10. It's only not a 0 because, like Birds, it has structure. That's the only good thing I can say for it. I do not recommend anyone read this. It's not good and it's not true, and that's what gets my goat, is untruth.
Okay, update. I was talking to my brother Andrew about this play, and according to him it's hilarious. So, who knows, maybe it's just me.
I'm really excited about this next book, which is Aristotle's Poetics. I love this book. It is wonderful. I enjoyed this so much. I love listening to YouTube video essays, and this was like that, except more in-depth, more insightful, more cultured. I'm a story nerd. I love understanding the structure of stories and what makes a good story, what makes a bad story, and that's what this talks about. This talks about specifically plays, but it's in general can be applied to a lot of stories today, especially movies, which I found very interesting that a lot of what he talks about for plays applies to movies. And that helped me understand a lot of what he was saying, because we don't have as many plays these days, but we have a lot of movies. When he would critique low quality plays back then, his critiques made sense to me because I could apply them to a lot of modern Hollywood movies, especially when he talked about how plays can put too much emphasis on the spectacle, when that's really the least important of the 7 things that make up a good play. That reminded me a lot of modern movies in general, and how they put the spectacle and the visual effects above everything else when it's really the least important. Now, this is a tangent, but whatever. And Aristotle at least understood women. As it says in page 41, The second thing is that character be fitting, for it is possible for a woman to be manly in character, but it is not fitting for her to be so manly or terrifying. Thank you, Aristotle. You understand at least a little bit more about women than modern Hollywood. I was having so many insights while I read this book that I took a ton of notes in the margins, which I've never done before because I usually hate taking notes, and I've never voluntarily done it before I read this book. This is the first nonfiction book I've read that I've liked this much. Almost everything in this book is true. It communicates truth. It's short. Like I said, I like short. It's to the point. It's short. I like it. I'm giving this a 10 out of 10. Absolutely wonderful. You should read it. Okay, so that's all the books. I'm so glad that I'm doing this. And I do want to mention two notable exceptions, two books that I did not read during this time. The first of those is anything by Plato. I didn't read any of Plato's works. The only reason I didn't was because we didn't have any. We do now, but we didn't at the time that I was reading them. And so I'm leaving them out for this plan. Probably sometime in my life I'm going to read them, but not right now. The other notable exception, though, the more interesting one, is that I did not read the Bible as part of this plan. And I didn't do that before because I just didn't want to. Like, I felt like it'd be too much. But I really regret that I didn't, actually, because it would have given me something positive to read. Like, I wouldn't have had to wait so long for Christian authors because I would have had Jewish authors and then Christian authors much sooner. And I feel that my view of that period in history is incomplete because I didn't read the Bible along with this reading plan. So I'd recommend that if you're going to do a plan like this, definitely do it with the Bible in it. I think it would have been very beneficial to me. I think it'll be beneficial for anyone else who's doing this. I wouldn't say like read it in order because I don't think the books are put in order of when they were written, but I just recommend looking up when each book was written and including it in your plan. So that is all I have for you this time. Thank you so much for joining me as we discover truth in literature. If you want to try this out for yourself, I'd recommend it. I think that's a great idea. One thing that I have noticed while I've been going through this is actually that a lot of books, I used to think classics were so hard, but they're so much easier now. I think reading through the books in order is extremely beneficial because it gives you like a foundation for understanding the classics because they refer back to each other all the time. Like, they're always referring to those ancient myths and then they refer to each other, and a lot of literary references that you won't get unless you've read them. And also, a lot of these ancient books were written in such a different style than what we read today that it can be confusing to read them. But if you read them all together, then it makes sense because then you're immersed in that style. Your brain begins to pick up on the patterns and the rhythm of it. So that's very beneficial with this. So it's definitely made reading classics easier. And I'm so grateful to that because it means I'm not going to stop reading classics even once I've finished this reading plan. And that makes me so happy because I've struggled with reading classics because they were hard, but they're not that hard anymore. Hope to see you again soon. And remember, don't be afraid to start reading fairy tales again.